So now, again, we are privileged to have Professor Alex Rogers here with us today. Alex is the Director of Science at Rev Ocean, and his presentation will give a really lovely overview of a lot of these aspects that have been discussed in these presentations.
So folks, I'm going to kind of wind out a bit now in terms of thinking about carbon and fisheries and the marine environment in general. So what is blue carbon? Well, obviously it's where the marine environment is active in sequestering our emissions. Storage must be for a long time. It has to be influenced by human intervention, and it's important in terms of considering the implications of the loss of marine ecosystems. And we first started to think about this in context of coastal ecosystems, particularly mangrove forests, salt marshes, and seagrass meadows, where carbon is actually captured in the living tissues of those organisms, but also in the sediments trapped by them. So there's a huge amount of carbon locked up in the sediments trapped by seagrasses and so on. Kelp forests or macroalgal forests were initially not considered here because they don't have this trapped sediment, and we weren't really aware of where their carbon was going. More recently, it's been realised that these ecosystems are extremely extensive, and although they don't capture carbon in situ, they do export carbon to other ecosystems. And in fact, where some of those other coastal carbon ecosystems are capturing basically tens of millions of tons of carbon per annum, seaweed forests may be capturing up in the hundreds of millions of tons per annum. So they may be very important in this context. But we've started to think more broadly about blue carbon in the ocean. And the first lines of thinking about this were with whales. So whales capture carbon in terms of their biomass. They die and sink into the deep ocean where that carbon is sequestered. But also it was realised that through their feeding processes, they bring iron up into surface waters where it stimulates more primary production, particularly in low iron zones of the ocean. And again, this helps to sequester CO2. But if we look at this quantitatively, it's a relatively small contribution compared to those coastal ecosystems we've seen. However, this is the tip of the iceberg, and now we're realising there are many other processes out in the open ocean which contribute to this carbon capture and sequestration over longer time periods. I think one of the questions we've got to ask is whether human activity can actually influence carbon capture through these new mechanisms we've been looking at. I think the short and simple answer to that question is yes. So, for example, through the effects of climate change, we can see impacts on ocean primary production, reduced productivity of fish populations, which William and others have already spoken about today, but also the impacts of fishing, which has been discussed earlier in this session. It's not just overfishing which is a problem, it's also the impacts of the types of fishing which we're currently executing in the ocean. This is just an excerpt from a paper that was published last year, where it was estimated that bottom trawling is releasing up to 500 million tonnes of carbon from ocean sediments per annum. And this figure, of course, actually dwarfs the amount of carbon which is being fixed by these coastal carbon ecosystems, even considering them collectively. So the types of fishing we are doing is also a very important consideration, as well as the amount we're fishing as well. One area that particularly interests me is carbon capture through active carbon transport. So as you're aware, in the oceans we have the largest migration occurring every single day. This wave of marine life ascending into surface waters at night time where they feed and then diving into the deep ocean when the sun rises. And through this migration, carbon is transported from the surface into the deep ocean. This active transport is responsible for transporting, it's estimated, 900 to 3,500 million tonnes of carbon per annum into the deep ocean where it's sequestered. And of course, now we're considering fishing these mesopelagic stocks of life. And here, even taking a small percentage of these organisms has the potential to have a large impact on carbon sequestration in these ecosystems. So, just to summarise all that, coastal blue carbon is recognised now as a certifiable mechanism of carbon sequestration. Oceanic blue carbon has enormous potential and is clearly impacted by human activities. We need more research to understand these mechanisms and to quantify the amount of carbon being sequestered and how it's being sequestered. And ocean management, including of fisheries, can clearly reduce not only direct carbon emissions, such as fuel use, but also indirect emissions through things like habitat destruction. And finally, understanding of sequestration by macroalgae is increasing, and indeed seaweed farming may be a way of kind of formally certifying this in terms of carbon capture.